Hello again. Today we're going to be looking at an area of research in disability that I really find enjoyable. I love talking about the idea of quality of life and that schools can have an impact on that. So our topic today is one that's dear to my heart. It might be something that captures your interest, but it's one of many different approaches to thinking about inclusive practice. There are others. It's just one of the frameworks that really makes my soul sing. So once again, some questions just to focus your thinking, and you can take as long or as short as you like on those. And the slides to follow just remind you of things that might be important. So some definitions here about what we mean by inclusion. Certainly what is thought of in this course. So there are two main documents that specify the right to learn. First one was back in 1948, and there was probably not much need to go further, except that there was thought that people with disability weren't specified in the general declaration, and some people were finding they were missing out. So this made it for the absence of doubt, shall we say. So in Australia we've got the right to learn because we're signatories to those international conventions and because we think it's a good idea. So we've got the Disability Discrimination Act, we've got then the Disability Standards for Education, and those documents are in your learning materials. You can go through and have a look at some of these important areas in the Disability Discrimination Act and the standards. It's critical to think about the same basis, reasonable adjustments and consultation. So where we're headed in the lecture today, we've got quality of life, its offshoot educational quality of life and student wellbeing on our agenda today. Because these are so important. They're important for not just because we transmit knowledge in education, but because it matters how the social engagement takes place. So let's think about the good life. Don't you just want to be there in that hammock looking out over the beach? A beautiful place. Take a minute to think about how good that will be when all your assignments are done and you can reward yourself by sitting in a hammock. So think about what you would do. Let's pretend money's no object. All the things that you would like to do, what would you do? And I guess it comes down to why bother? Why do we do all of these things? Why do we learn things? I want you to think for a minute. Why are you in this course? What are you doing? It's cruel and unusual punishment if you're just doing it. But maybe you're doing it because you have to. Probably not. Maybe you're doing it because you really want to. What's that about? For me, we do things to improve our quality of life. Things that maybe are not too pleasant on their own, like studying hard in a course like this one, but we do it because we'd like to think that it's going to have some payoffs for us, that it's going to be worthwhile. So a lot of our education and a lot of things that we do, we are hoping that it's going to make a difference. So I want you to think about, how do you define quality of life? What matters to you? One of the interesting things about surveying people around the world is how consistent the findings are. Bob Cummins, who was at Deakin Uni, is still there as an emeritus professor. He talked about this as the golden triangle of happiness, that we can distill into three main things what it is from findings all around the world that people find leads to happiness. The first one is financial security. You need enough money. You need enough money, depending on what society you're in, it'll be more or less, but you need enough money to pay the bills, to keep your accommodation, to have enough to eat. But then after you have enough for financial security, having more doesn't lead to greater happiness. That's an important finding. It's an important one because we know that not all millionaires are really happy people. And sometimes people who are quite poor in perhaps objective terms, but have enough money to get by, are really very happy. And the second one is a sense of purpose in life. You've got to have a reason to get up in the morning, and it could be to go to paid work, but it also can be to go to volunteer work, or it could be getting up to read the paper or do a jigsaw or to help around the home. These things can give people a sense of purpose in life, and that's a really important thing. And the third one is good personal relationships. Someone that you're close with. It can be an intimate partner, a sexual partner, it can be a married partner, but it need not be. One thing what we do know is that for people who have someone close, very close, so not just a best friend, but someone closer than that, if you have that person in your life, that leads to greater happiness. Certainly friends also add to our happiness. Somebody, someone, some group of people that we can feel that we can talk with if we need. Now all of this research gets done in an area called quality of life. So quality of life is an interesting area. It's a field of research and a framework in intellectual disability that really speaks to me. It's a concept or a framework or a model that helps us to understand the life of a person with disability and to make sense of that in terms of a whole lot of areas around domains in life. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it gets compared to anybody else. It can be used as a sensitising notion. So it helps us to raise awareness, to think about things that might be important to help a person have a good quality of life. It can be used as a social construct. Now, social construct is an interesting idea. So it's not a physical thing that can be measured, like how much water there is in a dam or what time the buses are coming. A social construct is something that we as humans have made up, but it doesn't mean that it's any less real. So it can be used in that sense. It can be measured, it can be determined, but all of these things are because it's done as a human enterprise. The final point is that as a unifying theme, it brings together a whole lot of ideas, and researchers around the world have come together under this idea of quality of life. Now, quality of life is a well-known term that you'll now see in so many things, and this is just a few things that I did a bit of a search on images that use quality of life, and you can see that it comes into quite a range of different things. Well, one of the challenges then in that general usage is that it's starting to lose some of the rigour that's been in the terminology that is found in disability studies. So in research usage, it's a field of social research. It's got some agreed principles, domains and core ideas, and that's because it's come together. The researchers who were involved in this initially started to write down, well, what do we agree about on this? What are the domains of quality of life? What domains of a person's life are important? And what are some of the core ideas? It then has a potential value for understanding and guiding activities. So if you think about, well, what might they be in human life across the lifespan, you'd probably be thinking about early childhood development, you might be thinking about employment contexts, you might be thinking about life opportunities where people live, people with disability, what sorts of accommodations might they have, and so on. So it's got lots of applications. I want you now to think about what quality of life might be. How would you define it? And earlier on, when we were thinking about money's no object and what sorts of things make you happy, that's an idea around what quality of life might be. It's actually a really difficult thing to define, and some argue that perhaps it's not something that really does serve well with a definition. But I think it does help to have some common sense of what we're on about. So the sort of things that you'll read, it can be thought of as the social well-being enjoyed by people, communities and their society. So look at that, it's not just an individual. It can be thought of as community and society in general. Both objective and subjective. Now this is a critical point, that quality of life, it's not just something that has an objective measure. So somebody does a survey or whatever, or someone's opinion is determined as the definitive response. It also involves subjective views. So an example might be if somebody is not feeling safe. So where they're living, they're not feeling safe. Their subjective view is they are not safe. But an objective view might be, well, this is a very secure house, locks on the door, there are staff to support the individual, they've got a lock on their room door, they've got window protection, whatever. If the objective view is that the person actually is safe and you don't take account of their subjective view, then you're not getting the full picture. So in terms of quality of life research, objective and subjective aspects are considered critical. These are some of the areas that are important. So material well-being, so that's that financial area, then health, productivity, intimacy, all of those things that are considered important that you read in different areas of research. So here's some more definitions. Experience when a person's basic needs are met and when you've got the opportunity to pursue goals. So why do you get up in the morning? It could also be thought of as the discrepancy between your needs and wants and the situation you're in at the moment. So if you're perfectly happy in the way you are, whether you appear to have a lot or very little, if you're happy with what you've got, then you've got good quality of life. If there's a big discrepancy, so you might already have what other people think is a lot, but you still want more, then your quality of life mightn't be considered to be so strong. So that's another way of looking at it. I want you to stop and think about it now. What might you do to apply that to people you know? Can all people have a life of quality? Stop and have a little think about that before going on. From the literature, there are some key points. It would be considered now through decades of research in disability studies, all people can have a life of quality, purpose and value. All people. Now that means not most people, except for those few that we know who might be profoundly disabled, or none of these sorts of exceptions to the rule. All people can have a life of quality. Now, there's some people who've done some really fascinating research in this area. Gordon Lyons is one, and he produced a way of determining how you could judge the quality of life of a person who had profound or multiple disabilities, people who had no means of communication. And it was a validated instrument where people who knew the person well, so maybe 2 staff members of an institution, would be able to look at that to consider the person and determine with a great deal of overlap the quality of life. And he used that as the director of one of these centres to be able to make decisions such as to consent to general anaesthesia. He was giving an example of where people had to have a tooth, dental work, for example, and whether to consent to general anaesthetic because that's not without risk. And he was then able to use this instrument to be able to justify making a decision where the risk was there, but it did improve the person's quality of life because having dental work when they weren't able to understand what was going on could have been very stressful and distressing. So he was able to say, well, if you have less time in your day being distressed and more time doing activities you enjoy, that's going to improve your quality of life. So I think that was, for me, a very interesting and helpful perspective. Within quality of life in literature, a person doesn't have to change to fit in. So in terms of disability studies, it's not up to a person to somehow make themselves better or to be more fitting. No, instead, it's really a person has a right to be as they are. And if they have that right, they also can have the choice to improve their quality of life. So education then takes up the purpose of helping a person improve their quality of life rather than fixing them up. So the core ideas in terms of quality of life, remember I said that they've got quality of life has principles, core ideas and domains. So some of the core ideas are listed here. The core ideas around personal control and empowerment, variability and holism. So variability means that individuals differ from one another, and holism, that an individual is more than just one aspect. So they have lots of different aspects and we need to consider the whole of the person. We need to take a lifespan perspective for quality of life. So we can look at a point in time, but we need to recognise that people move through life and we can think about how we can prepare for different life stages, and that will improve quality of life in the future. Choice, responsibility and opportunities is a core idea because in disability, many people, certainly in the past, weren't given a lot of choice. They weren't given opportunities and they weren't given responsibility for their own lives. And then the final core idea is around perceptions and self-image. So your self-image is what you think of as yourself, and perceptions is what you think of how other people see you. And perhaps you're thinking about the relation here to education, because that's where we're headed. So I want you to think about those now and think about how they might connect. If we're looking now at education, here are the core ideas, and you could, if you didn't already stop on that slide previously, you can be thinking about education principles and how they might apply. I'm going to take you through these from a perspective of maths education because that's my field, but you can apply them to your own, and you might be thinking about how you might apply these to task 3, where you're thinking about how the area that you're interested in, the area you work in, can be developed. Now, all of these things come under an area called educational quality of life. A colleague of mine, Mark Van Omen, and I started to explore this because the family quality of life emerged from quality of life, recognising that what we think about with individuals has only part of the story when individuals live within families. And we started to think, Mark and I, about, well, children go to school, and it's the major area after the family of influence. And in schools, there are so many connections. So it's the individual with other learners, it's the individual with their teachers, it's the individual with interacting with the organisation of the school. So we started exploring this, and we talked about it in terms of some principles. My favourite of that is that the student voice is central, and it's been a helpful sensitising thing for me, because I recognise in some of my research that even though I view student voice as central, sometimes I forget to even gather it. So it's an important aspect for me. The domains that we consider important are learning, curriculum and teaching, school organisation, the school community, so that's beyond the school gates, and then the vision and culture of the school. Indicators are the sorts of questions or sorts of things that you might look at when you want to measure those areas. So connecting educational quality of life to education, as I was saying, this is about, I'm going to show this around inclusive maths education as an example, but I want you to think about your own context. So in learning, in maths inclusion, I'm interested in things like, what are the opportunities to learn mathematics? What approaches to learning are on offer? So we've got the right to learn, and we know about these, we've already talked about them. The rights of the child and all of those other ones. Now, we talked about that earlier on. Year level appropriate curriculum is an important area that we can be thinking about in terms of mathematics, but in general, in the learning context, that opportunity to keep learning and not get stuck just doing the same stuff over and over and over again because you either missed it or you're not able to learn it. That limits people's opportunities and it diminishes their education quality of life. This is an example of year level appropriate curriculum. The first photograph here shows a worksheet that was given to a boy in year 8 or 9. I can't remember which year. Now this student could not do simple arithmetic, and so he was given a worksheet to practice it. The only trouble is that it was pretty obvious to that student, as well as all the other kids in the class, that this was babyish stuff and it wasn't the sort of work that he was too keen on doing. Now his teacher was wanting to do something better as well, and so was the mum. So the mum had asked me for some ideas, and so I had a chance, if I'd talk with the teacher, which I was very happy to do. So I talked with the teacher and asked what she would think about giving him a go at the work they were doing in the class. And so this is what this teacher did. This is the sheet that came home instead. So the class was doing an introduction to linear equations, which is an aspect of algebra. And if you have a look at it, he has to solve for y. And in the first part here, you can see he's got to solve for y equals x. Let's see if I can change the colour. So what he has to do is substitute in these various values, -2 plus 7, then the next one will be -1 plus 7, then 0 plus 7, then 1 plus 7, then 2 plus 7. And the teacher has given an example of what to do. See, it says solve using your calculator. So he doesn't actually have to do the arithmetic, which he can't do, but he is practicing again and again, and he was actually going to be using his calculator over here as well. So what he's doing here is practicing simple addition again and again and again, but now it's in the context of the other kids in the class, and he loved doing it. So his mum got this straight away. Because I asked her, if you got a copy of it, and she took a photo and sent it to me, and he loved doing it. So this is this idea of year level curriculum, you learning what you need, but now and in a context that is like the other learners, and it's at the year level of the class. So I think while we've got a right to learn, we've got a right to the sheer joy of it, and the kids who are given this opportunity tend to really, really love it. So age-appropriate curriculum is a term that it's sometimes used, and you'll see that in the literature. I prefer the use of year level appropriate, because sometimes learners are at an older or younger age, but it's really their enrolment, what class are they in, that you look at. So you start with the specified curriculum for the year level, and then you modify it as you need. Now these ideas came about a long time ago, and Bruner was a theorist who perhaps gave us most help with that. Now when he talks about any child at any stage of development, he's actually meaning a school-aged child in the context of the book. And that book's in the library if you want to have a look at it. It's a small book, very readable, very quick to read, but I think quite challenging. So thinking about learning, that was that one. Well, now what about curriculum and teaching approaches? What might we do to boost educational quality of life? Well, you can think about, here's another example. How do we make decisions about curriculum? You might remember these, I certainly do, but they're fading. The old cash registers that didn't actually do anything rather than tally up. That one didn't even tally, it just recorded the amounts, and then a person had to add them up by hand. Then bank books. You had to be able to write down and do the calculation because you were entering it by hand into a book. Well, these things have given away now to online banking. So e-commerce is such a big deal all around the world. And things keep changing. So PayWave, this idea of tap and go, that you don't even have to enter your PIN. And they continue to change. So now we can use our phones to just pay for bills as we go. And there's even talk about having things in our watches so we don't even have to worry. So instead of needing to have a really deep understanding of arithmetic and be able to do mental computation, we can now help people to use the tools of mathematics that are readily available. So the digital age brings workarounds to our fingertips. Moving to school organisation now, or maybe I should just say the planned and delivered curriculum and what we think about in terms of putting in for mathematics does therefore change if we're thinking about using the equipment that's available. So moving to school organisation, what we have here is to think about the sort of things in the indicators column, physical resources, staffing and timetabling, in terms of mathematics education and inclusion. Here we've got all sorts of issues, and one of the most important areas is an area that's been a great deal of interest for education research has been around streaming. That idea of ability grouping, whether you get put in a class based on your attainment. The evidence is clear that this does no good for anyone, not even the top students. And what it does is cause considerable harm to learners who are in the middle or bottom groups. So those sorts of school organisations can have a great impact on mathematics inclusion. So an inclusion story now. How do teachers go about doing it? So let me introduce Kerry Kerr to you. She's a teacher in the ACT, and I was partnering with her in a research study where she was including a student with Down syndrome in her primary school classroom. One of the delightful things when I first went into her room was I noticed on the posters in the back wall was a series of photographs around different subject areas, and in the maths one there was a picture including the student with the disability. No great fanfare around it, just there she is, just as one of the other kids doing the maths. And for me, that was an example, beautiful picture of inclusion. No big fanfare, just all the kids getting the support they need in their context. How this teacher took part and took her lesson was that she had the children initially on the carpet doing their, she was doing a lesson on volume, and she was wanting them to build the first layer and then work at the idea of each layer then being the same. The volume is then just the area at the base times the height. So here's our student with Down syndrome in the midst of it all, getting the instruction for the subject area. Here she is making her bottom layer with the little blocks. Now at that point, once they'd made it, the teacher said to the kids, okay, I want you to go to your desks and I want you to get out your maths books. And then she said to the student with Down syndrome, I want you to go and get your iPad. And at that point, I thought, oh, well, that's the end of the lesson for her. She's going to go off and do another activity. But I was wrong. Not for the first time. This is what she did. She was using this iPad here and dragging little blocks to copy this. So she had to get a diagram of this shape. And what the other children were doing was drawing a diagram in their books. And I asked her, the teacher afterwards, I said, what was the about the iPad? And she said, well, I realised that the student wouldn't be able to draw the diagram easily because she's got fine motor difficulties. And she said, it wasn't the point. The drawing wasn't the point. The point was to get a diagram recorded. And so she thought about what could she find to do it instead. And she spoke with such excitement. This was a place value app, so it wasn't even specifically designed for this purpose, but she thought, I know I can adapt this and use that for the purpose. So the teacher then was using this student, whatever she in the lessons, and this is another lesson, she's using this the lessons to help the learner to do what she needed. So in this case, the children are doing mental computation, which is beyond this little girl, but her job was to roll the die and to read the numbers off that then would be used by these children to do some mental computation operation. So she's having her needs met in this classroom. Here's another example of learning what you need. This is a probability lesson, and in the bag are little counters, and there were some green ones and some yellow ones, and someone had to count the counters, so why not let it be the student who's still needing to have practice in counting small collections. And here are some more pictures of how she manages the class. She keeps nearby with the student, but she is also keeping her eye on the other learners in the room. She moves around the class, supervising their work, and then when they've completed an activity, she sits down and they bring their work up to her to have a look at it. And even though this young girl actually sits quite close, she still likes to get up and join the queue with the other kids. This is another teacher in the project. This is Melanie, and she's also a primary school teacher. Here she is talking with a teacher aide. So she had a teacher aide in her class at the time. In the first few minutes of the lesson, while the children are settling down, she would just update the teacher aide with the learning intention. So she would say, this is what I'm hoping to achieve in the lesson. This is what I'd like the student to do. If it all goes pear-shaped, here's another activity that I'd like you to do. So then the teacher aide sat beside the learner, but she was also assisting this boy here a fair bit, and he didn't have funding to have a teacher aide, but the teacher aide is for the teacher, not the student, and so she was able to support both learners. And at various times I saw her moving around working with other kids, and sometimes Melanie would come and work specifically with these students. So that was around school organisation. In school community, we need to think about outside school experiences and the connections with other groups. So what sort of opportunities are there in mathematics, as my example, for learning in context? Well, here was an example. This is from my daughter. She decided that she would spray paint her room with red spray paint. Not a good look, particularly when you're renting the place. So we had to paint the walls. Well, no maths teacher alive can allow somebody to paint a wall without actually doing some surface area calculations and working out the volume of paint, and we did this. Now, when we came to working out the area, it was obvious to me that she'd been taught this at school, because she knew the formula, so she knew how to write down area equals length times width. And I said, well, we'll need to measure that. And so we worked together and measured the length of the walls and the height. And then I said, well, what do we do now? And so then she said, we need to substitute in for the variables. Well, the language was hilarious because it's not the sort of language that we use day to day. It had obviously come from her school context. So she was able to transfer that into this new context, and she was also able then to substitute in to find the surface area of the wall without a window. And then when we got to the one with a window, we had to think, well, what are we going to do here? And so I said to Ruth, what are we going to do? And she said, well, we'll need to subtract, as though, what an idiot your mother is. But for me, it was such an important time, because I had never seen her understand or display understanding of why she needed to do the operations. So she knew how to enter into a calculator and to get the answer, but I wasn't sure if she was just following a procedure without understanding. And here was an example of where she knew what subtraction did, even though she couldn't do it without her calculator. So then we worked out how much paint we'd need and headed off to the hardware shop, and they tried to sell us a 50-litre tin when our calculations had showed we'd only need a 10-litre tin. And when I stood there looking puzzled and tried to see if I'd made a mistake in my calculation, the fella said, you'll get away with a 10-litre tin. And so I think it's useful to actually do the calculations. So moving from learning in context, let's think about vision and culture. When applied to maths, I think it talks about beliefs about mathematics and how it's learnt. These things matter in terms of an overall educational quality of life. A colleague that I worked with in the ACT was Matthew Garton, and he gave me this quote. In his view, a school leader needs a clear vision of what inclusion does and could look like in their school and must talk and walk it every day. So he was talking about how he made an inclusive school, and in view of mathematics, the real desire to have the opportunity for learners to engage with significant mathematics is really important for their educational quality of life, and sadly it's sometimes overlooked as though, oh, it'll be too hard for them, they won't enjoy it, let's find them something easy to do, and that can be very damaging. So when we asked earlier on why bother, I think my answer is because it matters. We have a direct impact on an individual's quality of life. It makes a difference, and we should be really focusing in on providing as many opportunities as we can. I'm going to now consider student well-being, because that's perhaps a branch of quality of life, and it's an area that's been explored in general, not just in disability studies. It's got a big area in different departments, so New South Wales Department of Education became very involved in it. It's also important in lots of different areas around the country. It's measured internationally, so PISA is the Program for International Student Assessment, and in 2015, which is the latest studies, it was done within science education. I'd like you to spend some time looking at these quotes. When students feel they are part of a school community, they're more likely to learn. But often they don't feel they belong. I find this could be quite sad. I think this one, when you read this is what students reported. So going back to the subjective versus objective, maybe the teachers didn't mean this. Maybe this isn't what they thought was happening, but this is what their students reported. And then what are the implications of that? Now the report is available if you want to read it. I think it makes interesting and important reading. If they don't belong, or they don't feel they belong, this can have devastating and long-lasting consequences. So if they have problems with their learning, if they don't feel like they're a part of the class, if they don't feel they can be successful, then this can have these effects. And in maths, that can lead to maths anxiety, so that's a genuine recognised condition. And then there's a tendency for us to focus in on negative events, and these become critical incidences that people have. They can remember these things with devastating clarity throughout their lives. But teachers make a difference. So remember, this piece was focused on science, but these results are applicable, I would believe, across other areas. So teachers matter. If we have a look at this one, on average, students who reported their teacher is willing to provide help, then they're more likely to feel they belong. And then these results suggest that teachers play a role. Well, good-o. It's good to know that we matter, because we really do. In our lecture this week, we've been thinking about quality of life, and then the offshoot into educational quality of life and student well-being. And so if you take a moment, think about what are the main points, what's challenging, and certainly you can raise any questions you have with me.